Dan Thompson, welcome to the Undraped Artist Podcast.
Hey, brother, how you doing today? Nice to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me.
I'm doing good. So, like I said, I've been following you for 20-something years. Ever since weren't you at the Grand Central Academy for a while?
I was a co-founder. Yes, sir, I was.
Yeah, and I think that might have been when I discovered you. And man, what a powerhouse group you had then down there. I want to know more about what your path has been since then. We'll get to that, but yeah, I've been following you ever since. You're a master draftsman and painter, so it's great to have you on the show.
Appreciate it, man. Yeah, really admire what you're doing too. The work that you've got on your site, the paintings, the portraits that you have, they're very impressive. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, man. That means a lot coming from you. I appreciate it. So you are headed to the Portrait Society for the first time this spring, right?
Well, it's not the first time.
Oh, it's not.
Yeah, I was at the one, in terms of PSA, I was at the one that occurred in 98, I believe it was.
And you were way back then.
Yeah.
The beginning.
Even that was my second portrait conference, or maybe my second, I think, because I went to the Portrait Society conference that used to be called the National Portrait Seminar, which was done, I think, in 91 or 93 in Atlanta. And that was given by John Howard Sandon.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really interesting to see the iteration of it a few years later when it was PSA, when I think the two groups had formed because they had an ASAPA. It was called the American Society of Portrait Artists, and they had the Portrait Society of America. And it always reminded me of the Monty Python movie where you had the Judean People's Front and the People's Front of Judea in a half-joking way. Because it was, you'd say, I'm going to PSA this year, and people would confuse this one with that one. It was kind of like Academy versus the National Academy. There's always a little bit of a disconnect there, but it was cool. It was really great to see it, and it was neat to be a part of the action when people like Kinsler and Draper were around, and Sandon for that matter. Sandon's gone now, which is remarkable because he started it, I believe, in 1979.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, he started the first version, the PSA.
First version.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And the first winner of the competition was Cedric Egley.
Jeez, man. Yeah, it's starting to have a big history. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and Cedric was my teacher back in, a long time ago in Maryland, and he had studied with his dad, and there was a pretty cool connection because I had gone to a school in DC called the Corcoran School of Art, which is no longer around, strangely enough, founded in 1879 and then eviscerated or some form or another at a certain point, I think, in this century. And his dad had studied there in the 1920s, and his dad had studied with a painter called Richard Sumner Merriman. Now, Richard Sumner Merriman was Abbott Thayer's assistant.
Really?
So that was the lineage, and you can kind of see some of that technical bravura work its way into what Cedric was doing in that amazing double portrait from 1979.
Wow. So when did the school completely close down? Do you remember?
The Corcoran closed down sometime around 2010. I'm not sure exactly, but it was founded again in 1879. And at one point, it wasn't just the Abbott Thayer influence, but it was Edmund Tarbell had a studio in one of the loft spaces that was in existence there at the Corcoran. And so it had a high pedigree. It had a really impressive collection. It had a George DeForest brush painting that was just stunning. A bunch of other famous early submission paintings when he was 23. And now it kind of just looks a little bit out of place, because you go to the National Gallery of Art and there are the vestiges of the Corcoran collection peppered throughout the gallery, and you just kind of wish it was back where it was.
Yeah. What a shame to be around like 130 years and then just done.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what happened, man, but I think it may have something to do with a lack of vision for leadership, a lack of awareness of maybe having your finger on the pulse of the constituency, the art student population, but something dried up there, something went sideways, It could have also been the Frank Gehry Commission, which I think was fairly expensive. They were always trying to rework the parking lot of the Corcoran School of Art because it was a block from the White House, so it was prime real estate territory.
Oh
They
my
always tried to make
gosh.
that into some kind of an annex that would also make an architectural statement. And I
Mm-hmm.
think they got into their skis and it didn't quite work out.
Wow. Do you know what the building is being used for now?
I do not.
No?
No. Mm-mm.
Hmm. Man. So when you were there, was it traditional education or had it gone kind of modern?
Oh, we'd gone beyond kind of modern, my friend. It was ultra modern. And
Oh,
I was, it was impressed upon me in no uncertain terms that everything was possible except for realism.
what? You're
Yeah,
kidding me.
realism was the thing which you couldn't practice unless you wanted to be a Neanderthal or behind the times or some kind of an ignoramus in 1990s form or
That's
1980s form, whatever the
crazy.
case may be. And so, I mean, the soul wants what the soul wants.
Right.
You can't deny that. And so you got to go in your own direction to satisfy a need to feel right with the world. And
Right.
so I went in the direction that I needed to go. And that started me down the path that you probably went down the path of as well, of trying to figure out exactly what all this means, of trying to get yourself prepared to
Yeah.
engage with your skill and come to terms with this heritage of ability and proficiency that is so profoundly apparent in the masterworks, you know.
So how did you do it? What was that path? What did it look like for you?
Well, you and I were around before the internet, and so
Yeah.
it was all kind of word of mouth. I mean, I wound up going, and this is why the Portrait Society conference changed a lot of my trajectory, because when
Mm-hmm.
I was down there in 91 or 93, I saw a lecture by a person named the aforementioned Cedric Egley, and he was giving a talk on rhythms of the head, which is this phenomenon of a kind of musical form of flow in the human face that exists in people. And you look for that as a measure of lyricism, expression, but also it's kind of the opposite of constructive thinking in the head. And I didn't know what he was talking about, but I knew he had something to say. And
Hmm.
that really appealed to me. And so I wound up reaching out to the Egley family, and they were kind enough to take me in a manner of speaking. And I went in that direction for a while. And then I went in a direction of studying elsewhere because when I went to the Egleys, it was very traditional. It was in a Northlight studio in what you probably would have seen for generations. Barely any, I mean, there was no electricity to speak of. You wouldn't need it. There was just a stove, a Northlight, and a model. And that
Hmm.
was great. That was really very different than being immersed in a community that emphasized technology, that emphasized a sense that new was better and old was bad.
Yeah.
And when I was in that community, I was learning about things that I felt like I needed to hear. Issues as fundamental as light on form, you know, the light on the skull, the light on the even the egg or the sphere. And then I could make acquaintances with people who had been elsewhere, like you did. And we found
Mm-hmm.
out that some of the people that we work with as fellow students also study with other notable visionaries. There was a guy called Myron Barnstone, and I was able to connect with him through a friend named Steve Griffin at the Egley Atelier, I would like to call it. And Myron was also a big game changer for me. I was able to go and spend time at his school up in Pennsylvania, drive a death trap of a vehicle up there, risk life and limb to really put it on the line to get a greater awareness, like we're talking about. And I think it's just a process of dedication, redoubling your efforts, and then immersing yourself in more profound ideas that thankfully you discover because you happen to be in the right place at the right time. Those are really valuable experiences for me, and they led to other things. But what's interesting is today, I think sometimes it's taken for granted that an institution is going to have these ideas, that someone's just going to walk in, pay their tuition, and get the information, then leave and become a famous artist. But when you had to work for it, when you had to
Mm-hmm.
savor the moment to, it's like, what was that name? Where is that person? Let me get a map and see if I can find that, and then try to navigate with my vehicle in, you know, terrible conditions so that I can find the right information that will lead me to the next step in life.
Yeah, that's true. I wonder how many people do take that for granted. I mean, it's so accessible now with the internet, even. I mean, you could live in the middle of Alaska and still get a good education online, at least relatively good, you know?
Yeah, I believe that's the case. And you're seeing a lot of
Yeah.
people online these days who still have that killer instinct. Like they will
Yeah.
stop at nothing to get this information. There are people in my online Patreon class from Saudi Arabia, from Portugal, from South Africa, from New Zealand. And those are generally the more motivated ones and the ones I enjoy working with as much as anybody.
We'll have to provide a link to that in this, so make
Okay,
sure you get me that before we're done here.
sure will.
So what about when you were a kid? Have you always known you wanted to be an artist?
Kind of, sort of. I mean, it's a bit tricky for me. I had a lot of health problems when I was a kid, and so I don't have a ton of memory related to that. But my parents told me that when I was really young, I drew a lot, and I started to draw according to my mom when I was two. And my
Can I
dad was a
ask you about that? Is that too personal? I mean, what was
no, go
it that
ahead.
you were
What you?
dealing with that made it hard for you to remember your youth?
Oh, I was pretty severely asthmatic, and I
Uh-huh.
was prescribed a medication we call it Benadryl, was called diphenhydramine, and I was prescribed that and others, theophylline and another medication that was adjacent to diphenhydramine. But I think it was the dosage that still bothers me to this day because, if I am, and if you are, we know this, if we are feeling a little bit under the weather, we'll
Mm-hmm.
take a 25 milligram dose of that and go right to sleep, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I was prescribed 200 milligrams of that
Whoa.
every day. And I was a kid. And to
Whoa.
this moment, it seems to me as though that was almost a issue of malpractice. I don't know
So you're
how
like
you put that.
walking coma half the
I
time.
was in a coma for about 10 years of my life. Yeah, I didn't really start to gain any sort of a memory for the experience of life until I was around 14, 15. Otherwise, I was essentially in a zombie state.
Oh my gosh, dude, that's rough.
I mean, it is what it is, but
Yeah.
that's what happened.
Yeah.
And as a result, most of what I can tell you about early childhood is from family, from when my mom was alive when she told me what I was
So she
doing.
just told you were interested in art. That's
Yeah,
wild.
she said, yeah, that I was into it because I
Dang.
was. Yeah, my dad was a cop and he was always working. He worked all the time. He worked midnight shift. And when he would come home in the morning, of course, he would stow his weapon. It was never around, but he never stowed his bullets. And so he left his bullets out on the table. And what I was told is that I was drawing with his bullets on the wall. And the issue with bullets on the wall is they don't erase. And that is the one thing that bothers mommy the most is not being able to erase the graffiti all over the house.
So
So
just the lead of the front of the bullet would
correct,
make a line on the wall? Really?
correct,
That makes
correct.
sense, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. And
That's
so
crazy.
time to get this one a sketchbook, but
Yeah.
you know, I was one of four boys, and so the cool thing is my brothers are all awesome, and we're still real close. So
Yeah, that's great. And where were you born and raised?
Virginia,
Virginia.
yeah,
And where are you now?
I was born in Alexandria, Virginia, and I was raised in Fredericksburg, or Stafford County, in Civil War country, and
Mm-hmm.
now I've been in New York City for about 27 years.
Yeah. So I want to ask you the same thing I ask a lot of people from New York. What is it about New York that keeps you there? Obviously, it's a great city. It's arguably one of the best in the world, if not the best in the world, but it's so expensive as an artist. What is it that keeps you there?
The ideas, the stimulation, the community. I'm in a creative community. I'm in an educational community called the New York Academy of Art, and I've been here as an instructor since 2001, like
Okay.
just about 24 years. And I've been teaching in the MFA program for 23 years.
Oh,
And
okay.
I was able to just by by way of interacting with very talented people, very capable people, derive certain opportunities here in the city, which organically began to also unfold, like creating GCA and also creating Janus and also teaching. I taught 10 years at Parsons School of Design. I taught 10 years at a school in Philly. I
Wait a minute,
taught
these
at
must have
National.
overlapped. Otherwise, you're like
Yeah,
85 years old.
yeah. Well, I kind of feel like it sometimes, as you do. But it was great because it goes to your question, which is why are you there? And you're there, at least in my case, because of the complexity of the ideas and because of the way they make you stand back and question and reevaluate and
Mm,
readdress issues that, again, going back to the Corcoran days, were made out to be very simple, and the issues that were backward thinking. There was something about going into representationalism, which was placed in the under the confines or in the lens of being beneath more contemporary thinking. And I found it to be anything but the case. I found it to be, by connecting with this group of people and exchanging ideas and trying to constantly iterate through being a teacher, that there are so many profound back alleys and back doors and ways through technical engagement and teaching and the practice of formalism and just working in the classrooms. It has been amazing. Being at the
mm.
league has been amazing. Being at the academy has been amazing, and it's kept me here for a long time. But I do sometimes think, like you said, that it would be nice to get out of here at some point and kind of
Yeah.
do other things.
Yeah, I mean, it's expensive in Salt Lake City. I can't even imagine what it's like to survive in New York City.
Yeah, I've never been to Salt Lake, but I've always wanted to go. For a while, I was following the lectures of a person named Micah. I don't
Oh,
know.
yeah. He's on my podcast.
Okay. Yeah, I
Yeah,
really
he,
like that he was going after some of the less traveled roads, people like Jean-Paul Laurence and others that are just not talked about anymore. I really appreciated that, and I
yeah,
thought it
he's
was
great. And also he really has a hunger for knowing the artist's perspective, which I don't think a lot of art historians have. I think it's a rare quality.
I find it to be the same case. It's weird when you get somebody who's an art historian who can draw,
Yeah.
because they have a whole different avenue into that mode, into that narrative, because it involves the creative practice. And
Mm-hmm.
most of the time, when they're separated by that membrane, there's something really profound about that separation that prevents them from seeing into something that's vital to understand the artist.
I agree. 100%. I don't think Micah draws. It's just got this innate curiosity, though. Yeah, he's a huge asset to our community. Big time.
Cool.
Yeah. So, okay. So, when you finished up at all those schools, at what point did you help found the Grand Central Atelier? And how did that whole thing happen?
Yeah, I was in this mode of teaching workshops as well as teaching the in the kind of programs that require a commitment of a year, contractual arrangements, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I had been teaching workshops since about 98. And I started teaching workshops in LA. And then when I was just about, when I was married and we were maneuvering, kind of getting into a mode of where we're going to live, where we're going to be, I was teaching in all sorts of places. I was teaching in Santa Fe workshops. I was teaching in Seattle. I taught a bunch in Florida, up in Boston, DC, obviously New York, and LA. And I would bring my wife with me and I'd say, if you like this place, honey, we'll settle down. This will be where we're going to go. So on
Mm-hmm.
the surface, it's a workshop, but it's really a test of what environment you really are tuned into, what you like, what appeals to you. And everything was always going really well in LA. The LA workshops were just a blast. I loved the people and I loved the fine arts adjacent practices, the special effects. The LA Academy wasn't really an academy formally. It was more of a kind of it was a venture. It was an experiment. And so they rented out a special effects studio or an artist who did work for special effects kinds of projects. And I remember going through this guy's space, looking at the prosthetics, looking at the alien costumes, and just feeling like it was a really good thing. And so after connecting with the students on that front and having really great experiences, I was offered a gig to run a thing called Atelier California by the burgeoning LA Academy of Figurative Arts. And while I was in conversations about that, about negotiating under what terms I would be teaching, when I would be working, would I have a space, that kind of thing. Would
Mm-hmm.
there be compensation for traveling 3,000 miles across the country? I was talking to Jacob. Jacob had been my teacher at the Water Street Atelier, and I really held his opinion in high regard, especially because, when you got a teacher, there's something in them that they occupy a sacrosanct position in your mind. And so he was a really great advisor to that. And that was going on around 2004 or 5. And at some point, the conversation shifted, and he said to me, Dan, I'm thinking about what it would be like to create something in New York that is more of what we're talking about, what you're talking about doing in LA. And that was a paradigm shift. When we started to discuss that, the the other issues came up. He was part of an advocacy group called the Institute of Classical Art and Classical America, which has been around for a long time. And they're mainly concerned with the preservation of buildings like Penn Station in and around New York and other places, that those don't get demolished.
Mm-hmm.
So Jacob and I and Michael and Kate began talking about the concept of
Michael
creating a school.
Grimaldi and Kate
Kate Lehman, Michael
Lehman.
Grimaldi.
Okay.
Yeah, we all got to talking about the creation of a school under the auspices of the ICA to exist in the Mechanics and Tradesmen's building on 44th Street, just down the street from Grand Central Terminal, that would become, eventually, it would turn into Grand Central Academy. And
Wow.
that's how that grew out. And in the beginning, it was a beautiful experience. It was amazing because we had access to all the statuary, these antique casts. We had a risen Christ by Michelangelo, the original form and scale. We had all sorts of things that you wouldn't have access to. And those
Why though? I
became,
don't understand. How did you get access to all that?
because they were being preserved and, in a way, protected and shielded by the ICA.
And then they just opened it up and allowed you to go and use them? I mean, did it cost you anything? How? I don't understand.
Well, there was a rental of the space in the same building, but
Okay.
the school, the early days, anybody who's around knows that the school essentially was a continuing education program within the ICA. And there
Okay.
was even talk about the name of the school, because I believe, if memory serves correctly, that Jacob wanted to call it the Atelier, or I think it was the Academy of the Institute of Classical Art in Classical America. And I thought it sounded too long. And so my email was, what about the Central Academy, Beijing? And that email got passed to Michael, and he said, what about Grand Central Academy? And so that's how we named it. It was Grand Central Academy. And it
Hmm.
was a great
But because you were
situation.
in that building, the same building as all these preserved statues, they just said, well, you might as well use these too.
Yeah, they put him in the elevator, brought him up to the 6th floor, and distributed him. And we
Amazing.
made a bunch of lighting situations. We jigged up I think they called it the shanty town, the thing above everything that was just essentially chewing gum and clips and tape, and don't breathe on it or it'll fall down. And that was our lighting situation. And then
Yeah.
somebody got together and made the easels. I remember that. Those were all made in the kind of traditional style, the book height easel. And then someone else did the lighting assembly in the life room. And that is where it went.
Wow. Was that scary? I mean, did you had to come up with rent, I'm assuming, and probably didn't start out with any students, or at least too many students.
There were quite a few students, as a matter of fact, and it wasn't too scary because my role was mainly the instruction role that I occupied. We all taught, but also there was something about organizing the program and curriculum that interested me, and I was able to contribute in that regard, and that opened up a lot of fascination and a period of inquiry on my part, looking at curriculum, looking at programs. So I found it really stimulating. I found it amazing because when you have to create a program, as you know, having your own atelier, you have to devise what what is the nature of, like, the beginning? What do you constitute as the beginning of your program? What are
Mm-hmm.
your foundational principles? And then what do you layer on top of that? What are you going to add to that to develop a sense of further study, or a level 2, or an advanced type of study? What does all of that entail? And all of that was amazing.
Yeah. Wow. So I imagine you said you had a lot of students. You just must have built up a lot of hype.
I suppose so. I'm not quite sure how it all panned out because those were heady times. There were a lot of schools being created and co-created around 2000 to 2010, I suppose.
Yeah.
And people were eager for things. We had, yeah, it was a period of time that felt different than today.
Yeah. Well, I'm not surprised you had people lined up because, man, what a powerhouse group you four. Holy moly. I remember watching from a distance in magazines and so on and just being like, man, what a group. You guys were like
Uh,
the Fab Four. But so what happened? How come now it's just Jacob? What happened? You guys all went your separate ways and
well, it at some point, this is part of the learning process. It became a matter of whether education becomes indoctrination or whether education becomes an enabling phenomenon
hmm,
to help you get to where you need to go as a student. And that was the crux of the problem for me. That's
okay.
where our visions of what learning and studying were diverged because I don't want a person to be studying in a very rigorous situation and to feel beholden to the lessons that they
Mm,
are contained or somehow uh, they're prevented from operating with their own instinct.
right.
And that that was a very, you know, yeah, that was a kind of earth-shaking crisis that arose in the program after the second year. And it was essentially like, cool, if you want to do your thing, I'm going to do something else. And so I split, and Michael split about the same time, and then Kate left, and then about a third of the students departed as well. And it was requested of us that we continue the study or the program that had originally been envisioned for the students. And that's when Janus Collaborative started up in Harlem in
And that was
2008.
with you and Michael
And Kate,
and Kate.
yeah,
Okay. And how long did that one last?
that ran 6 years.
Okay. Why didn't you continue with that? It must have been a great school.
Yeah, there were a host of factors that contributed to the demise of that project. Probably the most um, overbearing of them was the gentrification of that part of the city. When we moved in, we had these great skylights that we had installed that Kate helped us build. And somebody tried to take out our skylights with batteries. They were on one of the rooftops, just
Oh
throwing
man.
batteries at our skylights. But that was kind of the way the neighborhood was. By nearing the end, 5.5 years later, an Applebee's opens across the street, and it's like, oh, it's coming
Gotcha.
to an end, folks. I mean, now that the Costco is opening, the Applebee's is opening, it's just not going to be conducive to the fine art feel. It won't be in the price range that everybody can afford. It won't be possible to make things, kind of work in a longer, like you can't sit there and make another 5-year plan because it's pretty clear that your building is going to be gone fairly soon. It's going to be sold, that sort of thing. So we had that. We had a few other issues related to programming, instruction, and students that made it a good idea to call it a day on that program after 6 years. It ran 2 cycles, which was great because again, it was a chance to delve into curriculum and think about how exactly education can work.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking about your experience with Grand Central and we I had I've had the HEIN atelier in one form or another. It used to be called something else, but the HEIN atelier in one form or another for since 2002. And it was probably around 2008-ish, I think, 7 or 8. Some guys approached me here in Utah and were like, hey, we want to do something like this 50 miles south of here. And we called it the Bridge Academy. And we had a similar experience. I got in there. I was there for maybe a year. And I realized, man, we don't share the same vision for what
Mhm,
education is. And the
mhm.
problem with artists is we don't compromise very well because we wouldn't be in this field if we weren't passionate about what we think and feel about, about art making. So it was too much for me to compromise my education ideals. So I took off, and then a year later it closed down. So it sounds like a similar experience, although Grand Central's going strong, so it didn't close down, but
Yeah, and I'm a pretty live and let live kind of individual
yeah.
in my pursuit. I'm interested in what I'm doing, and I can't turn it off. I can't switch that, that button off. But if people want to pursue that way of drawing and painting, I say more power to them. It's
Yeah.
fine with me. Yeah,
Somebody
totally
wants
cool.
it. Somebody's going
Yeah,
to want it, right?
yeah, it's no issue. Absolutely not. I
Yeah.
just think that it isn't where I stand. There
Right.
has to be a separation between the exercises, the scholarship, the study, the research, and that which you are going to do with that. Like what's important to make images of in the 21st century.
Yeah. And you have such a unique way of drawing. That's one. I'm going
Thank
to
you.
actually pull up a slideshow right now. I'll show some of your drawing and paintings. I hope I picked ones I could get off the internet and copy off the internet. So I hope they're ones you're okay with.
I'm good with
But,
it. Thank you.
but, yeah, your drawing style is nothing like what they're doing at Grand Central, in my opinion. It just doesn't look like it. It's very unique to you. It's much more gestural, much more energetic. It's their work is great. I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying I can see there's a huge difference with what you're doing. And I'm kind of curious how, maybe you can't even answer this because some of it I think is intuitive to us as artists, but tell me a little bit about your evolution. How did you end up where you're at in the way you approach drawing? This episode is brought to you in part by Rosemary Brushes. If you're one of my listeners who's a professional artist, you're already using Rosemary Brushes. But for the rest of you, come on. Take your work a little more seriously. Stop buying the other brands. It's just not worth it. Every now and then you may get lucky and buy a good brush from another brand, but use the brand that professionals like myself are using. Go to rosemaryandco.com, link in the description or the show notes, and get yourself some quality brushes before your next painting.
Through lots and lots of teaching, probably. And through lots of
Teaching or
teaching,
learning?
right?
Teaching yourself.
Well, as you get to a certain point, once you've read the science and practice of drawing for the third time, the only way to really get to the next level is to begin really sharing your own
Oh, right.
ideas and
You being the
perspectives.
teacher. Right. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. You being the teacher means you are the learner. And one of the most valuable things about the teaching experience for me was going into the Art Students League because there's something about the free form nature of studies at the Art Students League where you have to essentially take a principle and repackage it for this person who has X amount of years of experience, this other individual who's brand new, has no experience, and
Mm-hmm.
break it down and constantly transform it into something that a person can understand. And I just think that makes you understand it your own way because all of those ways of packaging it can be rolled into strategy. You could be thinking about a certain thing, and strategically, it's never occurred to you that it is possible to do it this other way, or to take the principle and clothe it in this other manner. And I found that free form way of teaching to be very, again, stimulating because there was no curriculum there. There still isn't. And you create your own atelier. But the one major X factor and the stumbling point is that people could enter the second week of the third month. Somebody else could finish up the end of the first month. Somebody else starts. You don't see them again for a year. Then they come back. And so it's weird to nurture a dialogue with a person when there isn't a sense of that kind of consistency where you can frame out the motif or the idea and go with it and run with it and build on something. There was always this idea of innovating, improvisational teaching. And that helped me a great deal because I taught a lot of short pose at the league, in addition to the painting classes that I taught there. After Nelson retired, they asked me to take the class, and I taught painting there for a number of years. But earlier than that, Michael's appointment for the Palumbo class came through, and after that, he vacated Fridays, and that was when I moved into that position, and that became a short pose course for me for about 11 years. And there was something about teaching short pose for 11 years that just I found invaluable because it was a chance to reconnect with the magic of gesture. I mean, Nicolaides likens gesture. He likens gesture to the wind in the trees in his writing from 1941. And it's such a cool way of envisioning things because, again, you have the form of the tree, then you have the animation of the tree itself. And that's the way gesture is in the human body. It's energy, it's life. And I think you never really appreciate that until you have to go back to it again and again. And it's become my bedrock. It's become the basis upon which I make everything. That is to appreciate the life or liveliness or vitality in the human body, in the human cadence.
Oh gosh. That brings up a lot of questions right there. Well, I don't know that I could possibly dig deep enough without literally moving to New York and signing up for your class. But can you tell me a little bit more what you mean by that? I mean, I'm not sure I quite understand. As I'm watching these drawings pass by, and one thing that I'm noticing by them is you're a huge proponent of structure. I mean, you really seem to analyze in depth the three-dimensionality of the forms you're doing, but at the same time, you're talking about movement and life and gesture. And so to me, they almost seem like two ends of the spectrum. And how are you marrying those two things? And maybe you could explain a little more what you mean about infusing life and gesture into the figure and how that's separate from the structure that you clearly are so good at.
Be happy to. Thanks, Jeff. For about the past 7 years or so, I've been working with Weill Cornell Medical School, and I do a class in the cadaver lab, in the cadaver studios. And when people come in, because I get constituencies that enter, and some people take it again, some people take it 3, 4, 5 times, and some are there for an hour and then they just can't handle it and they leave and they write me a letter a few months later saying, I'm sorry, I just couldn't take that. But
Mm-hmm.
the first thing that you see when you behold the gifts, we call them gifts, we call them prosections, we call them dissections. But what you see is that nobody's home. There's nobody there. And that's what I'm talking about. That same thing which is missing, that same thing which is intangible. You can't measure it, you can't hold it. It's spirit. That's what you see in the gesture of the human body on the model stand. That's incredible. And to see that permeate the body, to see that what makes us who we are is actually something that you can't measure, to me is all the motivation I'd ever need to want to pursue visual arts.
But if you can't
So that,
measure it, how do you record it?
well, you can't teach how to record it, which is pretty awesome.
Okay.
But you can go after it. It's like that Winston Churchill quote where you figure out something that's impossible to do, and then you dedicate your life trying to do it. You just continue to go after it and after it and after it. And you find that there are iterations within the figure that reveal a sense of the personality, the character, just as there are iterations within the face. I think they call them micro expressions that
Yeah.
happen during the course of a session that you may have with a seated model, a sitter in pose. And those can reveal the individual. And those are some of the magic moments. And so I see that happening in gesture, but I also see it in long pose. And this is probably a major separation between me and the folks as earnest as they are over at GCA and the other ateliers.
Mm-hmm.
They're emphasizing shape, they're emphasizing optics, and I totally get it. That's great. I think that works well. And it's a necessary component in today's discourse. It's just that I see the long pose as a very slow sense of gestural behavior, the the senses of the body's activity, the intrinsic nature. It's like a glacier, an avalanche, something that requires a supreme amount of empathy to envision and to execute in the body.
You're so poetic, man. Have you always been this way?
No, I don't think I've ever been all that. I
It's
try to do the best I
amazing.
can, but
It's
I appreciate that.
amazing. I love the way you speak. It's just, I love it. It's very poetic, the way you speak about art. It's amazing. So, this analogy with the avalanche or the glacier really made sense to me because
Yeah.
what I'm hearing is that you're very carefully and empathetically watching every twitch and movement of the model and just sort of editing and picking and choosing the things that best describe the character of that individual.
Yes, indeed. There's something neat that allies itself to this. In that department that I mentioned, into section at Weill Cornell, and it used to be on the business card, but they took it out for some reason. You walk into the facility and it says above the cabinets, it says the Department of Anatomy and Human Visualization. It's
Mm-hmm.
perfect. And that's
Yeah.
what it's all about. You're practicing human visualization. You're practicing how to see the body in 3 dimensions, but how to get certain pulses, pulsations, whatever you want to call it, electricity to animate the figure in space. And in the course of visualizing, you're trying to imagine what's going on with contractions and with the weight conduit, the way the weight will descend like that avalanche, like that river of form will descend through the body. And there's certain things that will happen within that are just interesting from a narrative context, like how a model holds herself or himself up, what they're doing in a contemplative sense as they're in pose. Are there any ironies? Are things happening with their body that you've never seen before that would open up certain vistas in your mind to be able to be prepared for the next pose or in some future situation where you carry that thing that you learned from this one drawing into a new drawing. So it's stuff like that. It's visualization, and visualization is a very active occupation. It's not passive.
Oh, is there any amount of experience that would make it possible for an artist to be able to draw this out of the subject using photography? Or is it required that you have this so-called avalanche, the movement, the subtle movements and weight of the living subject?
I don't tend to teach a lot from photography because the way that I engage with it, and I'm not saying it's a bad resource, the source imagery, it just feels like it's already been processed via a mechanical lens
Right.
as opposed to a binocular temperament, not just an organic set of eyes, but a person who sees with an eye that feels.
Mm-hmm.
And when you see with an eye that feels, you're feeling the weight and the pressure and the tension. And you don't get that from a picture because you get a frozen instant from the image. That's why I'm usually opposed to teaching from photography, especially on a foundational drawing level. And in virtual settings, I'm almost always teaching from either masterworks or from physical specimens in front of me, like casts. So I think it's a different issue.
Yeah, but what about working from I'm talking about in a professional sense. What about working from life? Can you apply these skills and this visual empathy to a photograph with enough experience?
Oh, yes, indeed. And then
Okay.
some. And then some, absolutely. There's no question that the people that are doing incredibly impressive work with a photograph have they've cultivated an apparatus within them to interpret what is going on in front of them, to
Right.
find the right forms of emphasis, to exaggerate, to interpret. And they interpret the photograph, and I think that's what makes the really good ones.
Yeah. Yeah. How much this idea of and please correct me because I don't I and I'm not just saying this to be humble. It's pretty obvious I don't have the same poetic vocabulary you do. So if I misinterpret anything you've said, correct me. But with this empathy that you bring to the model, and then so you're trying to understand the model, you're trying to just do more than copy and edit and bring out the things that best characterize that particular individual. How much of that is really you digging deep about the individual, and how much of that is actually you bringing yourself into the work? You know what I'm saying? So let's say you choose to edit something, you like the way this model tends to put his or her weight on one leg or something, right? And you emphasize that. That's your choice, right? So how much of it is really you that you're putting into the model versus drawing out the spirit of the model?
It's all you. It's just the way that the you manifests in the work at hand. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. when you're making a change, when you're making a revision, and I prefer the words revision as opposed to correction when I'm teaching, because I like somebody to appreciate that they did the best they could up to that point in time,
Right.
and they shouldn't look at what they've done in a pejorative way. They should look at the next step as an opportunity to enhance, improve, adjust, amend, revise, whatever the case may be. But when you make that shift, it's cool because if you could nail everything down in one pose, you wouldn't be able to because there isn't time. And so
Yeah.
you have to begin to compile what I would call a chronicle of the model in pose because the second pose is different from the first pose, however, slightly,
Yeah.
There's a shift there, there's a change there. And so you incorporate, almost without knowing it, a sense of idealizing what's going on because you want to wind up with the perfect looking knee. And somehow this position is the best one, even if it's slightly off from the original image of the model and pose. So you've got that. That's all you. And then you've got, in other cases, within the broad spectrum of the figure, you survey it and you look at the ankle and you remember your pontormo and you call forth a convention of
Wait. What
interpretation.
was that word you just said? I don't know what that is. Pontormo?
Pontormo.
What does that mean?
Pontormo. The Pontormo, the artist, Jacopo Pontormo.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, who, among many others, there are some great examples of people that offer these drawings to us, like Leonardo, like Pontormo, like some of the others, Piazzetta, and you remember that their drawings are full of interpretations, but those interpretations are like conventions that the Academy might have offered them in the 18th century or the 17th century or beyond. Like they'll look at the ankle, they'll edit out most of what's there, and they'll just put in the right calligraphic marks. And you might be trying to do that sort of thing. And so
Hmm.
I find that really neat because you're connecting to the legacy of drawing, to this idea of the people that pass the language down to you had certain paradigms that they share with you that influences your empathy. Because when you see it in the body, in the model, it's like you're seeing something that you saw in a drawing from a previous century. So you get really excited. And yet it's still you trying to make the convention, it's still you trying to execute the interpretation.
Hmm. Yeah, that's good stuff. Man, it's funny because you address some things that my students just asked me yesterday. They were like, "What do you do?" And I get this question all the time. So I have to discuss this all the time. What do you do when the model moves? I can't, they've changed position and now the shoulder's over here. What do I do with the arm? Because the shoulder's shifted. And so I'm really glad you addressed that, but I'm going to dig a little deeper because I'd love to get from a more technical angle how you would answer that. When you mentioned the perfect knee, you want to get the perfect knee. So you might just sort of look for the pose, the slight variation between poses. You might pick the one that best serves your goals, right? But then
Mhm.
how do you connect that perfect knee to the other femur? Do you know what I mean?
Mhm.
To the femur that's not going in the same direction as it was when you started the perfect knee. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, yeah, I get these questions too, where someone will be asking about the distance between the hip and the knee in the pose when a person is sitting on the model stand.
Right.
You'll say, is that too long or is that too short? And the answer I usually provide is neither one is the right way to look at it. What you have to do is you have to sell it to the viewer in a way that the viewer is going to buy that distance makes sense. So it's a matter of reconciling what you're putting into the knee and what you're putting into the hip. For example, if you have a very short distance, you have to foreshorten the knee differently than if you have a bigger distance. And if you inadvertently make the knee really short, but then make the knee at profile, it doesn't look right at all. It looks way too short. But if you make the distance appropriate to a shortened space and then you turn the knee and execute the proper convention, then you got it. So reconciliation might be a good
Love it.
way to put it.
Yeah. Which makes perfect sense that you would say it that way because you would have to. And coincidentally, we've got a picture of knee up here or a whole leg with this incredible structure drawing next to it. You would have to really have a grasp on structure to pull that off.
you'd want to go into the knee in a way that expresses your sustained interest in the condylar structure of the femur, in those beautiful oblong forms that they offer up to us, in the way that those are twisted in space, the idea that the medial one has more turn in it than the lateral one, the idea that the lateral one is a more sharpened structure, and that those dig into a very specific articular surface in the tibia that actually has these corresponding facets so that all the ligaments can attach appropriately. And if you can put that together into your imagination, then every time you draw the figure, it's really like a song because you start looking at the differences between this knee and the other knee as you implement the pressure systems in the body, but also as you delight
Implement the
in,
pressure systems. What do you mean by that?
I mean, watching the weight conduit
Oh,
when the
gotcha.
weight, yeah, when the weight drops through the knee and then drops again into the fibula, in the tibia, and then goes into the feet, there it splits. The weight continues to split as it drops down. I think when you put those things into a knee or into a foot, you have to articulate the forms as though they're really pressing outward, like they're under duress in certain ways, as opposed to a lyrical arm that takes no weight. It just kind of sits there on a tabletop. It's a different kind of form. And those are really graceful opportunities to try to make a difference in the body between forms that are under pressure and duress because they're tense or they're carrying weight, or forms that are much more rhythmic because they're not carrying weight.
Oh man, I want to study with you bad. You got some good stuff here. And I'm excited to take your class. I'm going to be taking your class in the Porch Society of America conference. So
Thank you. I
unfortunately,
look forward to learning from you.
yeah, right. It's hilarious. It's going to be awesome. I'm excited about it. Well, let me pull up some of your work so we can talk more in depth about this. One sec here. All right, so this is your Instagram. I'll pull up your website as well. But I think your Instagram is great because it shows how you do things more than just finished work. And this is what I mean by your knowledge of structure. It's like, what in the world? That is amazing.
Thank you for that. I've always been a gigantic fan of the Russians. The Russian draftspeople have been, in my opinion, the badasses of figure drawing going back
Oh yeah.
generations. And there, unfortunately, there's such a difficult political relationship now between the East and the West, but I can't identify a school of thought which I would admire more than the Russian school in terms of its dedication to constructive thinking, its dedication to what I would call the engineering of the body. And I've just always been inspired by them and by their example. I've used some of the artists there as individuals that I teach in my class. You look at this person's work, look at that person's work,
Mm-hmm.
because they exemplify this way of understanding the structures of the body. And I've looked at that. I've also looked at the Germans. Bomis, Gottfried Bomis is a real hero. And then there's a rather famous book in my circles made by three Italians, and it is entitled Struttura Uomo. And there are two volumes for Struttura Uomo.
Is
And
it in
between,
Italian?
it is in Italian, yes,
Oh,
sir.
bummer.
Well, you just need Italian friends, and then you're good.
Yeah. Do you speak Italian?
I do not, no.
Oh, that would be amazing.
But I do, in a weird way, I had this great experience when I went to, and I'm segueing out of this, but I'll get back to it in a second. But when I went to Shanghai to teach a master class, I had a translator there who was arranged so that he could translate the English to Mandarin and Mandarin to English, and we could have this great meeting of minds and ambitions and that sort of thing. And he was going to be there for 3 days. Okay, 3 days for
Mm-hmm.
a 3 day master class. He was there 3 minutes and then he disappeared. And so it's me with 20 students from all over parts of China, mainly Shanghai. And we really couldn't communicate. All I could say was ni hao and shishi, and that was it. Good morning and thank you. And they couldn't speak a word of English. And so it was a really neat thing because I could communicate, I hoped I could communicate through the visual language. And so I was doing these drawings with them from the model, and I was making a lot of diagrammatic attempts on the periphery, on the perimeter of the paper, and I would see them speaking with each other. They were really wonderful, and they would be talking with each other, and then suddenly one person would start nodding emphatically, and then you knew that it was working. And we wound up having this awesome
Wow.
exchange through the visual language. So when I think of struttura uomo, I think of how, even though I don't speak Italian, I could probably speak the universal visual language well enough to be able to interpret what they're talking about. And I like that very much. But
Hmm.
with those sources, especially the Russians, but the Germans and the Italians, there are opportunities, I think, for aestheticizing the anatomy, and that's what this drawing is about. I'm going after the wrist mainly because that's a part of the hand that the artist constituency I work with, the students, they don't entirely understand. And so we make every attempt to go after some of those component structures of the wrist and identify them in key terms so that when we move forward in the future, we're not just going to be drawing random structures and trying our best to copy the model.
So it's not just physical structure, but you're also considering anatomy here.
Yes, it's probably more, the idea of it existing in the imaginative realm where you're trying to see like that central column, that's capitate, and the capitate bone is the long column in the wrist that will eventually connect into the longest, most prominent bone in the metacarpal region, which is digit number 3, the middle finger. And so you have a column in the wrist going into the column of the middle finger, and
Is
you
that
can
this column
build
right
around
here?
that. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's capitate. And so capitate is surrounded by lunate, which is just above it, and lunate looks like a moon. That's scaphoid right there. And then
Oh,
just to the right is lunate. It's just foreshortened. That's why it doesn't look like a moon right there.
okay.
You're trying to assemble these overhanging, interlocking structures that can give you some pause on what's going on in that form and thereby awaken a sensibility for creativity, for, again, imaginative thinking that will carry your work all the way up to the surface where you can express the outward crust of the body in some means, creative means or otherwise, with oil or clay or graphite.
Oh man, you must have a pretty good memory to be able to recall all the names of these. That is so intimidating to me.
It's not too bad. It's just the name of them is associated with the vision of them. The scaphoid bone used to be called, in some of the older texts, it was called navicular. We still
Wait a
do
minute, you're
have
not allowed to know both names. I mean, I don't even know one of them.
we have,
What the heck,
but
dude?
yeah, it's a kind of a geek on that front, I'll admit it. But the cool thing is navicular, you think navigate. Well, the navicular in the foot is a boat. It looks like a boat. And so that's the reason why the names are cool, because you're thinking about what is going on, like trapezoid, trapezium, the pisiform bone. These are things that awaken a form memory as well as a
Hmm.
constructive interest in me. So, and then the other piece of, worth mentioning in that same drawing, if you go a little bit lower in it, is, yeah, there we go. On the bottom, you can see on the visual left side, there's a form right there, and that's a spoon. Okay.
Yeah.
And so, what I was interested in doing when I was at the Art Students League as a teacher, I would always make appointments whenever I could, as long as I didn't annoy archives, to borrow the old drawings. And I could borrow the Mowbray drawings, the Tweedy drawings, the Clute drawings that were in the collection of the archives of the Art Students League from the 19th century. I could borrow the Dumont drawings. I could borrow the other Johansson drawings. And then they had a bunch of Bridgman drawings. And there was one particular Bridgman drawing that he did where he arcs the metacarpal of the thumb in a convex way, and then he arcs the phalange area of the same form in a concave way. And so it was like a big S. And it
Yeah.
just seemed to me as I contemplated it that it's, the thumb is a perfect spoon. And so that's why I did the spoon there as the
Yeah, right
constructed
here.
drawing.
It
So
looks like
when
a spoon.
teaching, yeah, when teaching the thumb these days, I teach a spoon, and it really does seem to help my students understand it.
That's great. What
Yeah.
about this? I'm not sure I see this.
Yeah, I was thinking about some of the other constructions that surround the digit, the very distal edge of a form. And
Uh-huh.
so that's supposed to be at the very bottom, supposed to have a nail bed and then a nail
Oh,
and a
I see it
finger.
now.
Yeah, and then there's a bunch of conical structures ascending from there, and those encounter spheres or spheroid forms on the very top. And I'm just doing some idea generation about how I could attach a digit, a distal part of a digit, to the adjacent form that runs into it from a proximal side. And I do
Okay,
that
so
a
I got a
lot.
question for you. As
Yeah.
a teacher, you're
Hmm.
using words, a lot of words um like medial, lateral,
Yeah.
interior, posterior, like all this kind of stuff. And when you have a new student, I mean, I've been painting for 20 years and I'm having trouble keeping up. I'm following you, but I have to really pay attention. When you have a brand new student, how do you talk to them? I mean, are they able to even keep up? Because this is not a layperson's vocabulary.
It's definitely not a layperson's vocabulary, and you're right on that matter. It's important because when you're talking about again, the notion is visualizing the body. If we can associate that with a word I just brought up a minute ago, navigation,
Yeah.
there's a series of terms that apply to navigation, which are unusual terms. And
Mm-hmm.
we use those terms so that we can place our mind in the appropriate setting. So if I say medial, I'm moving more toward the midline area of the
Right.
body. And if I say lateral, I'm moving away from that. And artists are not used to using those kinds of words to define things. They'll
Or no
say,
one is.
yeah, they'll say
Yeah.
above, they'll say below. In anatomy, you say superior, then you say inferior. They'll say outside, but we say superficial or deep. And I think it's appropriate to try to start to utilize those terms because that also applies to the musculature. So if you go into the antebrachium, into the forearm, you'll find something that says it's flexor carpi ulnaris, and the identification of that is it's a spatial thing. It isn't only a flexor, it's on the carpal portion, flexor carpi ulnaris, it's also on the side of the body that is where the flexors come from. And so you're using those terms so you can identify the muscles as well as the space. Those things are important. And so when people are
Hmm.
new, we do have to cover this nomenclature question and how are you going to define things? It's the same issue. I'm sure you teach the boxes or the blocks in
Mm-hmm.
space when you're teaching the students. And I had teachers teach me that. And under their system, I was taught either XYZ or tip, turn, tilt. And I myself default to the anatomical terms, ideas of flexion, extension, lateral
Hmm.
flexion, and rotation, because I want to associate those with future anatomical discourse.
I might borrow that. Yeah, I think more from like an engineering mind, and so I'm more like XYZ axis. But
Yeah,
I think that
whatever
makes
works.
way more sense what you're doing.
Well, I think it helps because if you really want to situate, again, your mind, like pinpoint, like we used to do with triangulation in map making
Mm-hmm.
pursuits, if you want to triangulate yourself into a conceptual space, it helps to have terminology that is appropriate to the task.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. So every student in the beginning, you kind of have to go over this stuff with them, make sure that they're on the same page.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we also have to talk about working as much as possible from memory and teaching yourself how to see the vistas beyond the intense study of the body, because again, you're going to roll this up into a further pursuit, and this is designed to enable you to get back on the road that you're on.
Wait, work from memory. Are you encouraging them to draw from memory or to improve their memory?
Both. When the students essentially finish up my course, the last exam that I have for them is a full-on figure, three-quarter front, three-quarter back from memory with everything labeled accurately. And that,
What?
yeah, that's an important threshold to cross because it's kind of like a rite of passage. I went through it with Martha Erlbacher's tests. She did a memory final exam, and it was just so empowering because if you do a memory test like that and you really do it raw, like you don't know like you put everything away and you do it based upon the orthodoxy of a memory exercise, you walk away after you discover what you did well and what you didn't do well with a clear sense of where you need to develop yourself. That's a
Oh, dude,
gift.
I couldn't do that. I don't think I could do that. I need to try that now. I'm not going to be able to sleep tonight, wondering if that's possible. That's great. Actually, I know I couldn't label it. There's no way I could label it, but I wonder if I could even draw it. That's impressive. So, do you have examples of some of these final assignments, or you have an
I could
example of
send
where
you
you've
some.
done it?
Yeah, I could send you some, sure.
Do you have an
Yeah.
example on your website or on your Instagram of where you've done it, just so we could see something in the moment?
Let's take a look and go down. A lot of what you see in the work that's being done, I mean, there are several examples of drawings that were started from life and finished from memory.
Okay.
And let's see, the one of Claudel, also the one of Aaron, right in the center. Can you go up a little bit? That one, right? No, up above that.
Oh, up above that. Sorry.
Above that. No problem.
Right
Uh,
here.
yeah, right there. Yeah. So that one was finished from memory. That was a demonstration I did for the American Conference of Clinical Anatomists. I did it at Weill Cornell earlier this year, and Aaron came and posed for me. And it's not a very finished drawing, but a lot of it was done out of my imagination after the fact. And
Hmm.
it would be important because even if you're working from life, you're still visualizing a lot of what's going on. You're still,
Right.
as we talked about, you're inserting memory. At times it seem inopportune or counterintuitive, maybe is the right way to put it. We were just exploring this in Egon Schiele, where someone is trying to liken Schiele's way of drawing to a technique that Rodin was practicing called the continuous line. And while this individual is making their thesis known, they almost casually insert that a lot of the work that you're doing has memory infused into it. And it was an interesting thing because they didn't focus on it, they didn't emphasize it. But when you really think about it, as your students are working from the model, they're carrying the image in their short-term visual memory before they plant it on the paper, so to speak,
Right.
or on
Yeah.
the canvas. And so in that split second, there's memory as an influence, and then of course there's interpretation as a major component of how it manifests on the canvas. And I just find those really neat because some people will lay out the idea on the canvas and they'll do what Rudolf Arnheim calls sharpening. You know what that is? Sharpening.
No.
They'll make what their observation gave to them, they'll make it a little more exaggerated. It would be like taking a curve and making it more curved.
Yeah.
Whereas others will take that same visual information as they transpose it to the paper and they'll level it. So they're either a leveler or a sharpener. And when you level out, you're making it less expressive. But that, I believe, is a function in some ways of how your observation is filtered through your memory.
But I mean, wouldn't the best drawing be some leveling and some sharpening?
Oh, for sure. You just want to be aware of when you're doing it and
Okay.
when you're not. That's the key.
Right, right, right. I think my experience in teaching is most people are sharpeners. And I'm constantly saying, like, you got to check the angles. Don't think of it as making a left or a right hand turn. Pay attention to that individual angle because people tend to be like, oh, I'm going left. And they swing way left. Oh, now I'm going right. They swing way right in contours, I mean. And I'm constantly trying to rein them in like, okay, but be intentional about it. If you don't have a good reason for it, don't do it.
Yeah, in gesture drawing especially, you exist on sharpening. Everything is sharpening because it's all supposed to be more poignant and animated and arresting, alert. And then you go to the end game, to the much longer poses in the atelier system, and they almost subsist on leveling. People that do those are constantly trying to level out the form for good reason because it makes a more nuanced look.
Mm-hmm. And if you're doing a portrait and you're doing a lot of sharpening, you can make a beautiful model look quite disturbing in no time.
That's true. But then there is facial expression.
That's true. That's true. Man, that's good. That's an interesting perspective. I've never even heard those two terms. All right, let's see. So we've got is there anything else figure related where it shows? Um, I want to look at this one.
Yeah, a good amount of that is done out of my memory. So that was my son when he posed for me for the Realism Live demonstration that I did. And I was making a follow-up video and I was trying to help people identify these major key markers and how you could manipulate them and move them around.
Anatomical markers.
No, just visual impulses that could be
Okay.
floated, like those pieces in red there.
Are you
My thinking
triangulating with those markers?
triangulating, and then if you see the blue part that pops up at the very end, those are derived from the reds. And what I'm trying to put in is breathing space. I need breathing space because I don't like drawings which are too brittle. I like drawings that allow you to learn through the process and to express changes that occur, discoveries that are made throughout your process and the development of the drawing.
I don't
And
understand. What do you mean breathing space? I'm not sure I follow.
I mean, if you look at the spaces between the reds and the spaces between the blues right there,
Yeah, I
they're
wish I
they're
could
not
pause it.
connected.
Can you pause an Instagram video?
I think so.
Oh yeah. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh, I'm such an old man. That's just sad. All right, wait, let's wait
Join
till
the
we get
party, pal.
let's wait till we get to that part. All right. Is it too early?
You're too early.
All right.
Come on.
Right there?
No,
A
one
little
more.
more? All right there.
There you go.
Ah, I missed it.
Ah.
Look. All right, let's go one more round here. I'm gonna get it. Is it right after the purple lines? Because I don't want to miss it.
It's right after those plums. Yeah, those plumb lines,
Okay.
level plums and vertical plums.
I'm like super nervous right now. Got
There
it.
you go.
All
Oh
right. All
man,
right. Now tell me.
brilliant. Perfect. Okay, so when you look at those big chunks, those pulses, those markers that are up there, there's space between
Wait, wait,
them.
which color?
Blue, dark blue.
Dark blue. Okay.
Dark blue. Dark blue lines, I just underscored marks that already exist within the drawing. You see, they're all different directions, and that implies that I'm trying to seek an awareness by intersecting them in a way. Like I'll do a heavy line, like with line weight where the dark blue is, then I'll draw a tracer line from the dark blue out to some other dark blue line, but I won't literally connect them. I want them to just communicate their presence to each other in a manner of speaking. And
Are
if
you
I can
searching
do that,
proportion when you're doing this or something else?
it's gesture, it's proportion, it's shape, it's perspective.
Okay.
Okay. And so when those things are built into a piece, the last thing I want to do is feel like I am committed too soon. I want to allow those pieces to sit there as proposals because essentially those are just gigantic edits. And if they don't communicate exactly what I'm after, I need to manipulate all of them together. I need to shift one or shift two or shift 10. But when I say manipulate all of them together, every time you change one, you change the whole thing. The effect is completely renewed. And so if I don't have breathing space, then I essentially need to start over, or I need to reframe the conversation with the person I'm working with because I don't want them to be committed to the shape. The shape is an element, it's important, but the gesture and this idea of learning as you go, discovering and being able to implement your discoveries as you try to learn more things is critical for me.
I just have to take a minute to thank each one of my generous patrons for your part in keeping this podcast going. I could not continue to do it without you, so thank you so much. If you're not a patron yet, but you love the show and you listen regularly, please consider becoming a patron. It's really easy to do and it doesn't have to break the bank. Just head over to theundrapedartist.com and click on the link Be My Patron on Podbean. And then choose a monthly donation amount that fits your budget. It's that simple. And what types of things might you discover? Give me a real world example. Let's say you've laid this whole thing out and for some reason you feel like you need to change direction and change 3 or 10 of those lines. What types of discoveries might you make?
Misunderstandings of the body's position in space, misunderstandings of the light on the figure. Anatomical anomalies are a big one. When you see something that you thought was a certain form, but it turns out to be another form, issues in the rib cage and the costal area can be examples, or any of
Oh,
those types of things. If you're drawing for a period of time and then you make the very wise decision, as you know, to walk around the model for a split second and look at the same pose from a different perspective, then you
Mm-hmm.
come back and you realize, oh my God, I totally misread this thing. And now can I incorporate it into the drawing without completely destroying the drawing? Those are great innovative opportunities that go to strategy, like playing a game of chess with a pencil.
Oh yeah, that's good. Yeah, so you might think you're on the right path, and all of a sudden you see a bump, and you're like, "That's not fat. That's an insertion of a particular muscle." I don't expect you to make that mistake, but you
Well,
know,
I mean, the great thing about it is I don't coach anybody on those being negative things. I believe that throughout the process, if you're attentive and if you're working in the right spirit of inquiry, then you're going to find stuff all the time that doesn't meet your standards. And it's not going to be debilitating. It's going to be the key thing that really made the drawing worthwhile. It's going to be the transformative discovery. And therefore, a mistake, you could call it, to embrace.
and how much of it? I think I know the answer to this. I think you might have answered it, maybe even more than once already. But how much of it is idealizing the form? And I asked that because I just finished this crucifixion painting, and I spent a long time painting his chest because I wanted this perfect balance between idealism and humanism. Or is that the right term? Or being human.
Mhm.
And so I didn't want it too perfect, but I also wanted it this this certain level of beauty and idealism. It was a hard balance to strike. So I found myself nudging bones and changing the shape of the rib cage, like, moving or making the serratus more symmetrical or less symmetrical, things like that. Do you find yourself doing that on the average drawing or at all?
I do find myself doing that on the average drawing, but what I'm usually saying to myself is I need to make this person, I need to be worthy of, usually in the portrait, of this person's presence. I need to raise my game to the level that, as beautiful as they are, I'm of the mindset that I'm working from the most beautiful human being that I've ever laid eyes on at this moment. Every time I have to feel like that, so that I don't change something or idealize something that's out of step with their form sense,
Gotcha.
form
You don't want to
sense, their
lie.
rhythm.
You
Yeah,
blatantly
yeah. So
lie. Yeah.
yeah, but your religious paintings that you have on your site are my favorites of yours, and I have to tell you that they really have a beautiful effect. My
Thank you,
wife was
man.
looking at them with me, and she said, these look like they were done in a previous century, and that's a
Well,
huge
thank you.
compliment. And
That's
that
quite a compliment.
But that sends a message, that sends a real sign. There's something very contemplative about it. It's deep and it needs to be deep. And so I think in the situation that you're referring to, it is an issue that you must contend with because you're speaking to a different narrative than you might if you're dealing with the immediacy of the figure,
Right. Yeah, it's a
where
different problem for sure.
it's a different problem. Yeah, but when you are idealizing, I think some of the other things that are involved in idealization, they go back into these weird territories of aesthetic interpretation, things like phrenology that you see in some of the earlier texts that in some,
Phrenology? I don't know what that is.
phrenology is when, if you have ever been to the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, there's a it's a museum of medical oddities. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
They have the skeleton of the corpse essentially of a lady whose body turned to soap. They have an individual
Wait.
who's
Wait,
she
that
turned to soap.
actually happened?
Yeah,
How does that happen?
I don't know chemically,
What the
but
heck?
yeah, it's a must
That's like
see.
that's like Old Testament crap right there.
They've
That's
got
crazy.
they've got the skeleton of an individual who had this terrible ailment. I don't remember the name of it, where he broke a bone and his body overhealed. He produced almost like a stalagmite of
Whoa.
bony calcification. And it kept happening and it kept happening. And so by the time he passed, unfortunately, quite young, as you might well imagine, they did not have to re-articulate his skeleton. He was already
He was
essentially,
fused.
he was fused. Yeah.
Oh
And
my gosh.
these things happen all the time. There are all sorts of bizarre circumstances that are not all that bizarre when you really think about it. Even back in the old anatomy texts, I was looking at I believe it's Cowper, but my friend who runs the medical library, she says, no, it's Cooper, but it's 18th century. And he says in the early part of this one chapter on the rib cage, he says, ribs, the rib cage has 12 ribs and, and vertebrae and all that kind of stuff. And then he says, sometimes we found 11. Sometimes we found 13. Sometimes we found
No
12 on
way.
one side and 11 on the other side. Sometimes we found 11 on one side and 12 on the other side. And so there's a kind of template under which we're made and identified and envisioned that you see in the anatomy texts, like in Richer and others. But then there's the reality of it. And the reality is we're all just a little bit different, a little bit imperfect, a little bit asymmetrical. And that becomes a tremendous resource for creativity. So to go back to the mutter, they've got a section where you can see all the things they pulled out of bodies they found inside of bodies. There is an extremely tall skeleton next to an extremely shorter skeleton. And then they have a skeletal display. It's a cabinet with 100 skulls, and those are dedicated to phrenology. And in phrenology, the bumps on your head determine the kind of person they thought you would be or were.
Really?
Yes. And so there's a book that I looked at again through the medical library, Spurzheim, where he's talking about physiognomy, and it's really weird. He describes it as a branch of the natural sciences, which it turns out it was completely defunct, as you would imagine. And then he goes into the bust of Cicero and tells you how you could establish that traits in the skull and the bumps and how they were laid out determine his marvelousness. That's what he says in the book.
Mm.
Or progenitiveness, his ability to procreate. And that was actually something that they looked at in terms of idealizing form. I just bring it up because we no longer have any sense of wanting to do that, but we're still idealizing the head. We're still envisioning that there are marks of, maybe you could say, nobility in the facial constitution, and marks of beauty because we have ideals of beauty. There is all sorts of facial cosmetic changes being made that are fascinating to me. And some of that has to go back to a kind of predetermined sense of equating, I don't know, godliness, as you see in those old Greek casts and such, to
Hmm.
humanity and a need to aspire to higher levels. Or I think some of that rolls back to the Greek casts that you teach on and that I teach on as well, and this interest that they had in aspiring to higher levels of being in the way that they could emulate the gods. There's got to be something in the way those form senses communicate that
Hmm.
to today that we're still doing, but probably in another form in today's contemporary world.
Hmm. You know, one of the things you said is that when you look at a model, it's the most beautiful thing that you've ever seen, in so many words. Don't you find that just kind of happens without even trying? Like I find it doesn't matter who it is, they can be someone that, society might see as average or less than ideal, right? It doesn't matter who it is, male, female, not too attractive, attractive. By the time I get 10 minutes into a drawing, I've fallen in love with the face and the figure. It's like you can't help but to all of a sudden feel like, wow, this is beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Do you
Mm-hmm.
find that too?
Totally. Yes.
It's
There's
so
something,
bizarre.
it's so bizarre, but when you have your receptors open,
Yeah.
there's something, I think Roger Fry writes about this super sensual nature, this super sensual nature that the artist has and can activate that allows a person to be totally receptive to what's going on, where they won't cloud their thinking with technical moves like chess moves. They're aware more of the beauty of the individual, the process, the opportunity to make something that's worthy of that individual. And I think it's a
Yeah,
great attitude to have.
it
Hmm.
is. And you can't really help it. It just sort of happens. All right, man, again, anatomy. Oh my gosh. I was thinking when you were talking about that museum with all those oddities, can you imagine teaching a workshop and they line up a model for you that has 12 ribs on one side and 11 on the other, and you're sitting there teaching anatomy and confused out of your mind as to why the bumps aren't lining up? That
I
would
did
be,
have a situation in LA where a model who worked with me could dislocate her shoulder at will. And it
Get out of
was
town.
the most amazing thing because it just, I mean, it captivates you and you can't help but just wonder and go where, your heart desires and ask the person if they don't mind doing that
It
again and
doesn't
again. We
hurt?
did that. So she kept, no, there wasn't any pain. She was
Wow.
wonderful and she was really proud of it. It was kind of neat because, models are a special breed, man.
They are.
Thank God for models and what they've done for us. And a lot of them go through so much to do it for us, to get us closer to our dream. But
Mm-hmm.
she could do it. And when she picked up a briefcase, which was her preferred method of doing this, her shoulder would slide out of the socket, the glenohumeral joint, and you could see a lot more of the acromion process of the scapula. It was quite amazing and illuminating.
My gosh, it sounds kind of horrific in a way.
People are so diverse in their physical capacity that, if it had seemed like it would put her in any degree of discomfort, then it wouldn't have been an
Yeah.
area to explore. But
Wow,
she
that's
was really
amazing.
into it. Yeah.
So what for a guy like me who has sort of a bad memory, not sort of a bad memory, I have a terrible memory. Uh, I mean, I would say about 90, no, about 100% of the names you've dropped during this interview, I've completely lost already. So what advice would you give for someone like me to be able to really understand anatomy, to be able to really know it at a really advanced level?
Well, I would start by doing structural drawing because the issue of anatomy isn't really anatomical thinking at all. It's how do you manifest anatomy in the body, as you alluded to. And the way that you manifest anatomy is through some kind of ingenious delivery system. And that delivery system is the box and the cube and the sphere and the cone and the ring and all sorts of other things, the pentagon that really do comprise the figure. It's amazing how if you hang out with the instructors of gross anatomy in the medical colleges, a lot of them talk about the geometry of the body. And that's
Yeah.
what we're talking about. Where if we can't create, as I said, manifest an idea, then we're kind of sunk. So your anatomy could be doctor level, but if you can't draw it out, the issue really isn't the anatomical understanding at all. It's the ability to create it or to recreate it or to build it conceptually in front of you, to visualize it. So I would get into that. That to me, going back to the photograph and the question of working from photography and photographic references, is the big mix up, the big Achilles heel of today's generation. They're working from photographs, which is cool, but it hamstrings them in terms of being able to construct geometric forms in space, being able to draw boxes, being able to draw blocks, to chart out and navigate spatial concepts. Seems the more someone's working for photographs, it seems like they have less and less of that capacity to articulate.
Hmm. Hmm. You know, another thing that amazes me about your work is I found that a lot of people who are really heavy in anatomy, who really understand anatomy well, they don't really tend to draw likenesses of their figure very well. You know, they're so structure heavy that they get a sort of a generic quality to their work. But you've seemed to have married accurate proportion with anatomy and structure, with advanced anatomy and structure. Is there anything you could say to that and how you seem to control both of them at the same time?
It's a great question. I've got a principle that I use, that I practice, called draw first, measure second. And I remember Myron talking about something that I would classify as adjacent to that. And he would say, never be a slave to the dumb tool. Therefore, if I'm going to do any kind of schematization of what I'm drawing, I'm going to do that after the initial image comes together, crystallizes. And so I'm
So
dedicated
you
to.
you you put you basically map out the proportions ahead of time, getting a likeness ahead of time, and then you apply the structure and anatomy.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I orient my affairs to promoting the visual, the optical first, and then promoting any kind of analysis of that visual second. And that's
Okay.
helped me a great deal. If I went at it the other direction, as much as I love Bridgman, it's interesting. You get sometimes the cast. I think there's a Bridgman cast drawing that I think about that the league has in its collection, and it looks like a Bridgmanized cast in
Yeah.
a way. It it sort of goes in a slightly comical direction unintentionally, and I think the reason is they don't hold to the fidelity of the image. That's why I give the atelier system a lot of credit because I think that that was an underappreciated aspect of study, was promoting what Florence Academy and what GCA and others have done, which is making people aware of an exactitude of replicating what's in front of them that we kind of got away from in the 21st, in the 20th century, that is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So is there anything in particular that you've got on here that you would like to address? Otherwise, I'm going to just keep on clicking on stuff here.
This is fairly organic, and I'm totally into what you want to talk about. I'm
Okay.
kind of, jazzed by, again, being on your program and the chance to do this. It's cool to talk about education because that's mainly where I roam.
Yeah. Yeah. And honestly, that's a huge part of my life as well. So this is a good example, I think, of what you were talking about. I mean, you really have mapped out these proportions well. And
Yes, I was doing this with a good friend down in Atlanta who I'm very proud of, who's become a very prominent painter. And I was giving him some lessons. He's very interested in the ideas of charcoal. He's a big charcoal person and loves the charcoal techniques. And in the context of this, our discourse was about an older technique called charcoal and crayon. And that was a technique that was used at the League in the 19th century, in the 1890s, in the Mowbray class. And so this was done in vine charcoal and then in Conte on top of that vine charcoal.
oh,
And that is what they used to do in those days.
is that to be able to achieve blacker blacks? What's the purpose of that?
Well, the way that we might think about it in today's terms, when you begin a graphite drawing, you may start with something that's kind of light and non-committal, like a 2H perhaps.
Yeah.
And their version of that would have been the vine charcoal. So they would go in and make the vine charcoal happen. They would actually erase with dried bread, okay? And they would work on Michelet paper, which was a famous old paper, a laid paper, a semi-tooth paper. And once they had all of those things resolved, then they would go on top of that with the sauce. Okay, I heard you interview Loganoff and he was talking about
Mm-hmm.
sauce drawing. Now, so sauce drawing is where you would take the sauce crayon and essentially rub it onto a piece of paper or onto the side of the existing drawing, which you can see in the old images from the League from the 1890s. You can see that passage of dark. That's the sauce crayon. And what they would do is they would roll their blending stump into that area, that pool, that resource, the reservoir, and then they would paint in the Conte crayon and make the image darker and more permanent.
Wait a minute, just to make sure I understand. So with
Yeah.
the crayon, they'd create just a thick layer of Conte in the corner of the drawing somewhere,
Yeah,
like a pool, so to speak. And
exactly.
then with the stump, they'd pull that material off and draw with the stump.
Yes, into the existing drawing itself, the formal drawing. It's already orchestrated in vine charcoal. They would go on top of it and pull it together, finish it off with the Conte crayon, the sauce crayon, and that
But
would create
it's
it.
not the Conte itself, it's the stump. I just want to make sure I'm clear. It's the stump. So they don't ever actually use a Conte pencil.
Now, there could have been some Conte pencils being used in addition for things like really sharp lines.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
sure that they had some Conte pencils that they also introduced, and those would have been, by the way, mainly Conte crayon number two. That was their mainstay, was number two. There were three forms. There was a number one, a number two, and a number three. The number one is usually the hardest one. The number three, obviously the softest. Then they would use the number two,
I
and
don't
I'm
even
sure they would have the pencils as well as the sauce.
I don't even think I've seen these materials. Do they come in like a brick form or something or
It's weird. The older boxes with the material look like it looks like shots that you'd use in a shotgun. You take them out of the box, you say, how would I ever draw with this unless I was going to do a Jenny Saville gigantic figure
Right.
drawing? But they were not used that way. They were rubbed off, and you would use the stump, the blending stump, the paper stump as your
No
drawing.
joke. I want to try that.
It's one of the reasons why I love the blending stump.
Yeah, and the blending stump's a kind of a no-no for a lot of ateliers, I've heard. But I find it really useful.
It's amazing. And it's one of the reasons why I use it too. It needs a champion. And I think it's unfair to dismiss it, denigrate it, and classify it in the category of like a no-go zone. I've been told at certain workshops that I've been teaching that a person had been caught stumping in the
I
atelier.
know, it's so
And
weird.
it's kind of absurd if you think about it, because it really just depends on the way you use it, not so much on the fact that it's used in the first place.
I tell my students, I don't care if you sit on your drawings and spin. If you make it look good, then it doesn't matter to me.
Well said.
Yeah, I'm going to try that. Can you buy that stuff today then?
Yeah, you can still get sauce. I think what
Is
was
that
the
what I would Google sauce? Like Conte sauce?
sauce crayon? If you
Sauce
can't
crayon?
find it, then you could just get Conte and rub a Conte pencil off on the side, and then you're fine. It's
Yeah, I want to try that.
still a great,
So
great
really it's a
material.
Conte drawing because the Vine charcoal's essentially eliminated when you erase it.
And not entirely, but mostly, yes.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
that's great, because you hear people come to you and they say, "How do I make this vine charcoal drawing permanent? Because it won't stick, it rubs off." And you say, "Well, it wasn't designed to be permanent. It was
No,
designed
it's
to
really
be,
not.
yes, it was designed to be temporary."
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a gorgeous drawing. Man,
Thank you.
the form that you have in the ear everywhere, but I don't know why I'm so attracted to that ear. It's remarkable.
Thanks, brother. I'm a big fan of the ear. I've always loved the ear, and I like teaching the ear. I like building the ear in clay, and I like a lot of the components of the ear as little metaphors inside the body.
Yeah, you can tell you really put a lot into the ear. I have to admit, that's like not something I put a lot of energy into, but I'm going to have to rethink that. Yeah. And another, here's, you had talked about tubes and blocks and so on. And here's a great example of that, but it's far more advanced than just a block. I mean, you're really thinking about the general shape of this mass in the rib cage.
Thank you. Yeah, this came about as a result of a conversation I was having with students online during COVID about breaking down the figure, like you said, from the overall specifically proportioned blocks, because they have their own tradition in the pelvis and the rib cage. They have specific distances and proportions that we abide by from Bridgman. They're in constructive anatomy. You can find them there. And taking them down to more of a tapered sense, we call it taper and flare. And in the taper and flare tradition, those are also really neat, because as I teach my students in the in-person setting, the tapers shift around a lot. They reverse on each other within the human body. And that really awakens an artist to possibilities, because they're not simple. If you just think, "Oh, I'm going to taper it and flare it and then I'm good," it doesn't work that way. It's really neat. And the drawing itself here was purchased by a collector of mine who is now no longer with us. And he passed a few years before his house was destroyed on Sanibel Island. So I believe the drawing has been destroyed, but
Oh,
it serves a
all of
record.
that's too bad. So this is meant for teaching purposes, but if you were to draw this, my assumption would be, well, I guess you kind of have done it. You've gotten the proportions down. So you're not necessarily building the structure too early. You've already established a likeness of the figure.
Well, that's a nice way to put it. The way I would have framed it is, I've got a drawing on the left, which is more free form. And as I said earlier, improvisational, just based on insight, the arrangement of tone, edge, light on form, that sort of thing. And on the right side, I've got an analysis going that is about trying to decipher what I'm dealing with. And I do tend to teach a lot like this, both online and in person, where I'm asking folks to create the schematic drawings, because I can help them identify, clarify form inquiry much more thoroughly, because I can see where their mind is as they try to interpret the body and the portrait and the anatomy.
That's an important distinction, where their mind is, because
Yeah.
I often tell my students, look, yeah, you don't see me drawing this stuff on, say, just a portrait demo or a figure demo because it's in here. I mean, I don't
Right.
have to draw it anymore, but I'm thinking about it,
Yeah.
right? So what you're
Yeah.
doing is you're saying, look, students, draw this thing so that I know what you should be thinking about, or what, at least what you would be thinking about if you were disciplined enough to do it in every figure.
Exactly. So you have the power to make a pictorial decision.
Right. Yeah. Okay, let's head over to your website, and I want to see
Okay.
some of your more
Sounds good.
finished work here. Let's
Got some
see.
things that are from the solo exhibition if you want. I think it's the first heading and
Well, let's
it's
do this too while we're already here. So this is, I just want to go over your Patreon, because for anyone who's interested, just go to danthompson.com/Patreon.
yes, thank you. I could say a word about that. I've been approached often, very often, about writing a book. And my answer is always, I'm writing a book already. I'm writing an interactive video book that will be multiple chapters, and it's called Patreon.
I
And
know.
every month I'm putting out another chapter essentially on a longer discussion based on teaching for over a quarter century. And that's what I'm dedicated to. I think people now learn a lot differently than they used to. And earlier generations, they learned from books, they
Yeah,
picked up books and they read a lot. These days they read differently, they intake differently, and they intake through video learning. And I found during COVID that what happened with this virtual learning innovation. Many of my colleagues thought it was a tremendous inconvenience and they were irritated by it and it came and went and they're like, good riddance now that it's no longer here. I feel quite the opposite. As I said earlier, there's a lot of people that are highly motivated that I'm meeting online. And therefore, I see the Patreon opportunity, the ongoing, the ongoing construct there as one to really air out ideas that are not constricted by time. So I get 15 weeks during a semester. I have to move on because I have to cover material. You talk about anatomy, so I've got a 1 day on the knee, and then I've got the next day on the anatomical leg and that sort of thing. But on this platform, we can spend as much time as is necessary on the concept until it's truly addressed, and that's a gift.
it is.
If you want to give it a shot, feel free.
Yeah, that is a gift. It's funny you say that people want you to write a book, and then you found that this is sort of your version of a book. That is exactly my experience. I was literally working on a book
Mm.
that it just some, I mean, the reason I did it is because I'm sort of a self-taught artist. I've been to several schools, but it's just a modge podge of information and good and mostly not great information that I've had to sort of, I don't know, edit. And as I've learned how to become a painter. Anyway, so I've created all of my own assignments, and they're based on principles that you and I would agree on, but they're unique assignments because I sort of came in a roundabout way. So I'm
Hmm.
putting this book together, and then I start teaching online, and all of a sudden, I start putting all this information from to 2 chapters is all I got done. 2 chapters of my book online, and I realize, oh my gosh, this is a way better medium. Forget the book. I'm done with that,
Yeah,
because online you've got text, you've got video, you've got audio, you've got graphics, it's so much more useful in getting the point across to your students. It's a
absolutely.
great medium.
Absolutely. Yeah. The graphics are key. The inserts are absolutely essential. The close-ups are unbelievably helpful. The
Yeah,
references. I do all of my own filming, designing, outlining, and then I do all my own editing. And that is incredibly time consuming. But I think that if you're going to be involved in this venture, you have to do your own editing so you
you
don't
do.
inadvertently edit out the wrong thought or make an incomplete thing. It's kind of like AI doing a foreign language translation. They don't really get it right. They don't get the metaphor right, even if they get the wording correct. And it's like that.
I know. I know. I've thought a lot about that too. I've hired someone, it's actually my daughter, to edit the podcast, but I'll never hire anyone to edit my online school for that exact reason. It's
Yeah.
just they've got to know exactly what I'm thinking and be one step ahead to not kind of mess it up. Is it just me or the rest of you guys also get weirdly excited when you order new paint? Because I don't know about you, but when I get paint in the mail, it feels like Santa just dropped my Christmas presents off at my doorstep. With Vasari paint, my paint of choice and the podcast sponsor, it's even more exciting. And let me show you why. Because when Vasari shows up, it comes in this incredible box where each tube lays in this little compartment perfectly formed around the tube in this nice soft foam. And it's surrounded by velvet, red velvet. Now you got to ask yourself, if a paint comes so carefully protected and surrounded by red velvet, you got to wonder if this paint is worthy of royalty. It is. Vasari is. So if you haven't tried Vasari, you're seriously missing out. And the thing about Vasari, it's not only the best paint out there, it's also made by an incredible company that's been around for 30 years and knows its customer by name. Do yourself a favor, go to vasaricolors.com and order yourself some for your next painting. You know?
Yeah, that's nice. It's a great way to leave a record of you being here. Because the thing is, if you had written a book, Jeff, and you take the book to the editing staff and they say, you know, can you make this a little shorter? Our readers don't really want big ideas that are, in our opinion, convoluted because none of us are artists. So why don't you make this, instead of 15 pages, make it 6? And you're just like, well, last time we met, you told me to make 30 pages into 15. And so it's not always about condensation. It's sometimes people really want to appreciate deep ideas on a broader level, you know, that sort of thing.
But also when maybe you don't experience this, but when I edit, oftentimes I'll realize I didn't explain it that well, and I'll make the adjustments in the edit.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
which obviously
I
no
don't
one
explain things as well as I want. Yeah. And so I get a chance to go back in and interpret myself. I'm usually cursing at myself as I'm doing it. And my wife is sort of confused looking at me. Why are you doing battle with you? But it's
Our
always
own
the
worst
nature of
critic.
things when you spend a lot of time alone in a room.
It's the truth. Man, I might sign up for this. You're a fountain of knowledge.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
All right. So where was it that you said we should go?
Oh, Upright 2024 was a solo exhibition that I had this year. Yeah, they invited me to do a solo exhibition at a college called Hillsdale in Michigan. And I appreciated the idea of doing I should say an exhibition in Hillsdale at a college, because it's in a learning facility. It's in a school. And much of what I've been involved in, especially over, during, and prior to COVID, has been educationally centric and involved in learning. And I thought, instead of going in a commercial direction, let's put artifacts of learning in the institution and have a larger conversation about that. And it was good. It was well received. It was really fun to go out there and meet all the students and you know, the staff. It was really a wonderful experience.
How did you do? Did you get some sales?
I did. Yes, I got some sales, and the sales are really important. Mostly I sell to folks who study with me. We somehow developed this magic kind of relationship as we work together over time. And we just continue to talk about their exuberance for this art form and mine, and where we can meet on the road together, converge ideas, and go from there. But yes, sales were pretty good. And yeah, I had pieces like that one, Ace, that went into it. I had the cover image, which is actually,
I hope people are watching right now, because I'm just flipping through the
I might
images.
have the actual image of that without all the wording on it.
Let's look.
Other part.
Is it this one right here?
Top right. Yeah, top right. So I started that drawing in the Cadaver studios at Weill Cornell, if you click on it. And then I came back to my space and I worked more on especially the rib cage and the shoulder joint. One thing about working in an art school context is everything is wired together. We call it articulated skeletons. It's wired together in very awkward ways. And what you wind up realizing is the whole body is like disconnected, and I'm learning it wrong, because I'm learning there's too much space between the rib cage and the pelvis. I'm learning that there's too much space between the humerus, upper arm bone, and the shoulder. And so I get a chance to go back to my space and look at the shoulder in a more natural sense. So I'm wiring it back together with armature wire. I'm looking at the clavicle from a foreshortened point of view. And then I go and try to do some structural studies on the perimeter of this drawing on both sides to visualize the sphere that seems to be hidden inside the shoulder, which is great. And then I go back to the cadaver room and I drew a dissected head, which I've drawn, many times before. And it may be a bit macabre, I don't know, but it turned out to be one of the most interesting experiences because of this conglomeration of different parts and
Oh,
hopefully
it's really
insights into
cool.
territory that I needed to explore.
This took me a minute. This is the scapula.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
what is this? What here? These ellipses, this sort of cone shape.
Yeah, it's really infraspinatus, teres minor,
Oh,
and
you're
their
putting the muscles on there.
trajectories. Yeah, their trajectories as they elevate, as they lift up and enter into the rotator cuff, respectively. And then I've got
Okay.
above that spine of the scapula, I've got supraspinatus, which is the one that initiates the activity we call abduction. And yeah, that
Okay, I
drives
didn't realize you're
down.
putting the muscles on there. That's why I was confused. I'm like, is there
Yeah,
like a
one of the
bump on there that I wasn't aware of? I
Yeah,
gotcha.
it's got all kind. Not only is it bumpy, everyone is slightly differently bumped, and most of the scapulae, the plural of scapula, that I'm looking at inside the cadaver room, you can hold them up to the lights above the lab, and you can see through the
You
bone
pick
structure of
these
the
things up and
scapula.
hold them up to the light? You can do that?
Yes, but the scapulae, they're like windows because you can see through the bone. The bone is so thin in many specimens, and
Wow,
that
I didn't
is
know
kind
that.
of amazing. Yeah.
The human body is unbelievable how complex it is. You know, I was thinking when you were talking about all those oddities, it's surprising there aren't many more that you and I are walking around in these complex bodies that seem to work pretty dang well with most people. They're so complex.
Oh, they are not only so complex and so majestic, but there are many more. I had a student that was a student of mine at the Art Students League, went on to Johns Hopkins and became a great medical illustrator. And
Mm-hmm.
then a few years later, he sends me a book that he took part in, that he did the illustrations for. The entire book is on anomalies. The entire book about not only the anomaly and how he re-envisioned the diagram, but also the case studies, the science, the papers, the supporting evidence that 15% of people have this and 30% have that, this sort of thing. There are
Mm.
so many bizarre, wonderful instances of things. I'll give you an example. We had a dissection specimen when I was dean of a school down in Philly. We had a cadaver that was available to us that I secured through Thomas Jefferson University. And we had this wonderful lady named Dr. Sputic who did the dissection. And then I would come in and do the instruction for the students and faculty on the body. And then we would draw together. And she was dissecting the arm, okay, the anatomical arm, and she found a third head on the bicep, a third head. So bicep means two.
Where did it connect?
It connected to the pectoralis major. And
No
so,
way.
yes, she found a third, and she found the third head on the bicep on one side of the body, but not on the other side of the body.
So when she's doing curls, she's stretching her pec?
I just said, Dr. Sputic, doesn't that make it a tricep? And she says, it's a bicep with an anomalous head.
That's bizarre. But seriously though, when it contracts, what would it do to the pectoralis if it's attached to it?
It's a great question. I mean, you have to really look at the form and see the kind of anomaly. It was a pretty small head, so it wouldn't have made a
Oh,
whole
right.
difference. But
So
another
interesting.
example, we're in Weill Cornell and we're drawing the same muscle, but in a totally different specimen in a totally different city. And I have this student who is working, and his corrugator is all tensed up, and he's looking at this subject matter, and I'm like, hey, what's wrong? And he says, I don't understand. I don't understand. And we started looking at it, and the long head of the bicep was going in the wrong place. It was going in the wrong section of this area, and yet it was not atrophied. It was bypassing where it's supposed to go. It was not in the bicipital groove. And it was just the weirdest thing to see. But that was another example
Was
of
the
so
groove
many
still there?
anomalies. Huh?
Was the groove present?
Oh yeah, the groove is in the bone. It's in the humerus.
But
The
there was no
muscle,
tendon running through it.
there was no tendon running through it, but it was still there. You still had two heads on the bicep and two tendinous
Huh.
connectors to their respective locations, but it wasn't going where it should have gone.
Wow. That is really interesting. Well, that just makes it more amazing that we're all walking around. That
Yes, indeed.
somehow the body still seems to work on most of us. That's crazy. All right, let's see what else. I want to look at your paintings too, but let me just
Okay.
scan through here real quick and see to get a little variety. So maybe a different medium here.
Sure. Red chalk. This is Connie, one of the greatest models we ever had at any school. The
What
league, the
about her is so
academy.
great, other than the obvious?
She exuded presence. What makes a great model is presence. She had
Hmm.
stage presence like nobody's business, and she had gestures running through her fingers and toes. So when she took a pose almost without effort, she became iconic on the model stand.
Hmm.
And she was perfect for things like red chalk, which she was posing for here. And this is one of those drawings where you do a lot of different brainstorming and place elements on the side, in the middle. There usually is a lot of, you talk about anomalous, there are anomalous proportions because the foot's big and the hand's big, and you change your direction. I think I started it on one side and then I moved positions to another side and just continued it and tried to let my line roam free and practice calligraphy of mark making. And then the layout we refer to as mise en page, which is the art or artistic nature of spacing on the page, distribution of imagery on the paper.
Hmm. Yeah, I love these. Maybe this is probably the wrong word. You just said the right word, but I've often thought of this just like a collage of drawing. I love that. I don't do that much when I'm. It's just not my temperament, but I wish it was my temperament. It's so beautiful. This
Well,
foot
thank you.
is insane.
Thank you very much. I
The
appreciate it.
gesture of that foot is just gorgeous.
Yeah, man, that's all her. She had that
Yeah,
inner
well, you
that
had to capture it.
energy. Well,
That helps to have a great model though. But
it certainly does.
I've
Yeah.
seen a lot of great models get really insulted by the people drawing them.
Well, you may have more temperamental models out there than we do here, but
No, no, no. I don't
they,
mean insulted like literally. I mean, I'm saying a lot of poor drawings of good models.
I
Yeah.
hear you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Models are neat though. There's a lot of really great stuff about the models and some model lore you can see on YouTube. People like you know, I don't know, Hetty Anderson and
Yeah. There's some people I see all the time. They're just everywhere.
yeah.
Yeah.
But I
Especially the
mean
New
like the
York
great
models.
like Audrey Munson, Audrey Munson.
That rings a bell.
Yeah, she was a very famous model. She posed for a lot of the notable artists like Daniel Chester French. And she lived, I think, to 104 years old. She died in an asylum in 1996.
Wow.
She
That's
was called
unfortunate.
America's first supermodel.
No
And
kidding.
I
And,
think they have 30 statues of her in the Met. And
and
she's also on the top of the municipal building in Manhattan, right next to the Brooklyn Bridge. And she passed in complete obscurity. I think it had been a quarter century since any relatives had visited her when
oh my
a
gosh,
distant
that's
relative
heartbreaking.
finally made a connection in the 1980s. Yeah.
So
But
I
our
was not to change the subject, but I was hoping to find your portrait that I was first. It might have been the first thing I'd seen you do. And I think it's your icon on your Instagram, but it's when you were younger and in
hmm
your Grand Central days.
hmm
And I just wanted to look at that with you because it is the thing that I saw. If not the first thing, it was one of the first things I've seen you do. Do you have that anywhere around here?
It may be on the homepage. I don't know. If you back away, maybe if you go to figures, maybe it's in figures, please.
Figures. Let's see.
Keep going.
God, this one is just, they're all gorgeous, but that one I really, really like.
Thank you.
My gosh, your work is incredible.
I appreciate it. Thank you, man.
No, I don't see it. It's kind of. Now that was done what, like 25 years ago or 20 years ago?
Which one?
The one of you, the one of the self portrait I'm talking about, where you're lit sort of from the
Oh, yeah.
bottom.
That was the one that won the portrait conference. That was in 2001.
Oh, did you get the Draper Prize with that?
Before it was called the Draper Prize. Yeah, it was the
Oh, so
grand.
you're already disqualified. Man, you
Well,
got it.
that was for the other organization though. That was the one that dried
Oh,
up.
okay.
Yeah,
So you're still good. You
I'm
could
still all
still do
right.
it again. Yeah.
I'm still eligible.
Yeah, congratulations. Yeah, it was a nice portrait. Now tell me about this. I've never seen you do this kind of work.
I had a collector who wanted me to do, this is a while back as well, wanted me to do an Annunciation painting, and I did this painting for that collector many years ago. He was all about Annunciation paintings, and pieces like the famous one by Leonardo da Vinci that is in the Uffizi were big motivations for him. And that was just something that I put together at the time. I think that was around 2008 or so.
It says 6 here.
Or six.
Pretty
Okay.
close.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good. Decent memory. Not too bad.
No.
And it was just a fun thing to explore that theme.
And then
Those
this
were
one's Sith Annunciation. What's this about?
that was a piece that I did for Lucasfilm that was involved in a larger book that they put out called Star Wars Visions, and they were trying to come up with different artistic interpretations of the Star Wars series and Star Wars concepts and folklore. And I was thinking about uh, it was the sequence, I think you'd say, in filmmaking.
Mm.
Uh, the the Phantom Menace one that came out, the episode where I think it was episode one, and the Anakin mother character says there was no father. I can't explain what happened, and so I was
Mm.
trying to with a Sith enunciation. That's why I put those two together on the
Ah,
site.
gotcha. Sorry, I didn't recognize. I'm not a big Star Wars guy.
Don't worry about it. No
Yeah.
problem at all.
Well, I want one question about your paintings, but I've had you here for 2 hours, so we'll wrap up here in a minute. But
Mhm.
you've evolved quite a bit. It used to be much more finished. I don't know if that's the right word. And
Maybe
then
quieter. I would say quieter
quieter is a good way of putting it.
maybe
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
sedate.
And then you got really chunky and painterly. What spurred that evolution in your paint process or your paint application?
Yeah, it happened in 2014
Oh, it
when
just all of a sudden?
Yeah, it happened in 2014. I remember the period of time because up until that moment, I had been teaching, as I said, since around 98. And for a long time, I'm sure you can identify with this. You feel like you are the embodiment of the teacher. You are the representative of the technique.
Yeah.
You, in a sense, you have to demonstrate the proper orthodoxy every time you stand up and paint, and that leaches into your creative practice when you're alone, when you don't have a whole bunch of students around you, you're still painting like the teacher. And 2014 is when Janus collapsed, and it was at that moment when I just had this feeling. It was like a profound, it was an epiphany. It really was, that I no longer paint for any audience. I no longer paint for anyone, and they're learning and framing what I'm doing in some sort of pedagogical capacity. I paint for me. I paint for feeling. I paint to explore, and I try to paint so that I can contemplate why I'm here. I remember I had a teacher I mentioned her earlier named Martha Erlbacher, and she tended toward the more performative at times, but she was a tremendously wise person. She had tremendous visual wisdom, and she would always say this thing. She said it over and over again at different times: art is about two things, sex and death. And it sounded like one of those almost humorous anecdotes that you'd carry with you and share with your students years later. But I've thought about it and thought about it, and she's right. The sex is the generative, it's the creation, it's coming into the world. And what you find as a teacher is people are trying to come to terms with why they're here. Why are you on this planet? What are you here to
Mm.
do? What can you do that nobody else can do? How can you speak in ways that others can't? And then once you figure that out, your whole issue is to contend with the fact that you got to understand you're going to be gone. It's reconciliation. What can you leave behind? What are you going to leave that would be a suitable, even a perhaps even a profound thing that others would cherish, that others would want to acquire and keep and protect because of your imminent demise. So she was right. And
Oh
I
my
think at
gosh,
that,
that is so profound. That is, you know, and there's this frustrating place in the middle where you feel like you're finally starting to know what it is that you have to offer the world.
yeah,
Because
yeah,
I'm glad that you restated part of that statement. You said, "What can I do that no one else can do?" And then you said, "What do I have to say?" or something to that effect,
yeah,
which I think is more accurate, right? Because it's not about a
yes,
competition of excellence. It's about how you display the excellence that you're trying to achieve, right? It's that specificity that only comes with your DNA.
yes. It's about letting go and saying,
Right.
this is who I am. This is
Right.
what I'm going to be, and I'm good with it. And that was my moment in 2014 after the school collapsed because I was in a heap of, what do you call self-doubt, or
Mm-hmm.
there was a dilemma. There are things that happen in all of our pursuits, which we could fairly classify as disasters. They
Yeah.
happen. They're sort of like what happens in the arts. And I was in the middle of one of those things, and I just needed this to be my own thing. And at that point, it became my own thing, and let the chips fall where they may. I'm good with it.
Yeah. And then you finally find it. You know what you have to say to the world. And then you're just counting the days till you die. It's like, it's like, I feel like I'm finally getting to a point with my art where it's like, okay, I think I can do the thing that I'm supposed to do. And I'm not saying that like in a calling, from a calling perspective. It's not like I'm supposed to because the universe wants me to. I'm saying the thing that feels most natural to me, right? But I'm 50. I've got no time to express it. I got to get moving, you know?
Well, I mean, if you don't feel like that, then you're in the wrong business because every moment counts, every
It
day counts,
does.
every piece counts, and that's where going back to the exhibition, I was so enthused to put a show together for a college because I'm much more interested in learning. I'm much more interested in an individual's capacity by their own industry to raise their game, their awareness, their vision, and to connect with the world than I am to go into a commercial gallery. It somehow it still hasn't quite settled or fit. I I do fine with education. I'm really motivated by education, and for some whatever reason, the formula I've got going right now works for me because I continue to be maybe the primary learner because I'm so enthused and again exuberant about trying to know things and strive to get better at stuff.
You know, you and Michael Grimaldi have a lot in common from the short time I've known you and him. You're both very articulate and you both seem like born teachers. And it's interesting that you worked together and
Mhm.
founded that school together. But I'm not surprised that you feel that way about teaching because it seems from the short time we've talked, it seems like it's really in your DNA. It's like in your core.
Yeah, it is kind of magical, and I don't quite know what to say about it. It's just, I mean, I thank God it's there because I would still be the way I am, whether the teaching profession existed or not. And so, thank goodness there's a place where I can feel right about this endless motivation, this undying thirst to get better, and in turn to share it. Because the thing about teaching is you're paying it forward. It's your
Mm-hmm.
obligation to pass it on because the people that carry the language, they're going to embed their own interpretation into that language, and they're going to pass it to other people that will carry the language. They become the stewards of ideas. I talked about that earlier, this notion of a legacy, like a long-standing lineage of master apprentice. A lot of people have done that in our circles where they've traced things back to David or back to Michelangelo or something. But what I think we don't spend enough time contemplating is that when you carry it, when it's yours temporarily, it's your obligation to develop it as profoundly as possible, to infuse it with energy and somehow like a again an exuberance, and pass it on to people, and hopefully they do the same thing. I've thought about it too. I really venerate certain people like Dean Keller, and Dean Keller had a voice that I still hear in my head. You know, you hear your teacher's voice, and I hear Dean's voice, I hear Martha's voice, I hear Pat Connor's voice, I hear Nelson's voice. But I think Dean's capacity with language and his character somehow have made him immortal. And artists who are interested in fame, I don't think they appreciate as much the immortality of the teaching presence in the minds of the students. The people that work with Dean Keller are never going to forget him. Uh, you know, they close their eyes, they can envision the man and what he was doing and what he was about. He was so erudite and so much a philosopher, and such a gentleman too, such a humanitarian. And that kind of immortality is it's something you just can't pay for. It's enormously important. And by sharing a little piece of yourself, then you can also attain that, which is kind of neat.
Yeah. And you know what? I'm interested if you agree with this too. I feel like my students are my art as well. That being a teacher is a form of art because you are creating, but you're creating a next generation of painters. And so sometimes when I look at their work, I'm almost more excited about what they're doing than I am what I'm doing. It's like, oh my gosh, you did it. Like after all this work and this communication, you've done it. And it just feels it's a high that's very similar to the high you might get with a successful painting or drawing. Maybe even more.
It's a beautiful way to put it. I appreciate that very much. And I'm sure your students can appreciate that even more because as the recipients of your wisdom, they are getting to a place that they never would have found if were it not for your help and your guidance. And so that again is a really selfless thing to do within an art world that oftentimes appears, at least on the surface, to be quite the opposite. It appears to be a self-consumed world or
Yeah,
a
it can be. It kind of asks you to be, doesn't it? It's like the world's saying, okay, we want to know what you're thinking. We want to know what you're feeling. We want to know what inspires you. And by doing things like teaching, it keeps you grounded, you know, because
I
it
agree.
becomes about
Yeah.
others around you
Yeah.
as
I've
much as
always
yourself.
been much more interested, even consumed by the stories that have already been written, the artists' lives that have come and gone, because within the story arc, you can see certain things happening
Yeah.
that you wouldn't see if you're following contemporary artists. And maybe it's just the way that I'm made and what makes me tick. I think the underlying ideas and concepts are so much more interesting because if you pull them out, like if you pluck them out of art history and apply them to today, they're different ideas, they're different concepts because our world and our manner of living and the craziness of this world, like this world is totally absurd
Mm-hmm.
and we're trying to make sense of it. It's as though we're in a period of Dada again, or mannerism perhaps, and you see work being created that reflects these times. And so any sort of orthodoxy or academic concept placed in this world is really going to be unique because you could again replicate that notion from the 19th century today, but today's situation is totally different. There's a phrase I often quote. It's from Burge Harrison, who is lecturing at the Art Students League right around the time of the Armory Show, 1913. And he's trying to peel back the curtain of the future, but he can't do it. It's pretty neat the way he puts it in the lecture. But he says, I can't see the future, but what I can say is this: the only thing which should endure is that which is true to the spirit of its own age. And
Mm.
he really nails it with that because the spirit of this age is completely different from the way it would have been in 1913. And yet it falls on us to deliver what the spirit of the age is so that when people look back at this time, they won't know what it was like to live at this time, but we do. There's only a few of us. And
Mm-hmm.
if every piece counts, then we have a chance to leave something truly remarkable behind.
Yeah. That's a good, really good point. So if you've heard the podcast, you might have heard my final question. And it is, you've already given us such great advice, but I'm going to ask you for one more piece of advice. If there's one piece of advice that you had or wish you had that you could give to an aspiring young artist, what would it be? Or not young, just an aspiring artist. What would it be?
Get interested in research. Get interested in the lives of people who preceded you. Don't listen to the things that are supposed to be the things that should comprise a successful artist. Ask yourself what success really is. Success is success on your terms. It is not success imposed upon you by an outside authority, whatever that would be in the art business. I don't know what authority even means in the art pursuit, but success, to me, is fulfillment. Success is happiness on your terms and creativity on your terms. And the less you start trying to waste your life living somebody else's dream, you should aspire to live your own dream and be happy, because being happy is the best revenge for what would seem to constitute failure professionally.
Dang, you didn't even have to think about that. That just came rolling out. That was great advice. I love it. Man, one of the best. All right. Hey, thanks again, man. I am super excited to meet you in person. I promise I won't heckle you during the workshop or during the event at the Porsche Study. I'm going to be your best student. I want to be listening.
Oh man, I'm looking forward to meeting you,
peeled.
dude. I just, now that we have this behind us, and it's a lot easier to draw together than it is to talk or lecture or do a Q&A. It's going to be smooth sailing, and I can't wait to hang out.
I can't wait. Let's do dinner or something while we're there too.
Oh, let's definitely do dinner. Yeah, totally.
That'd be a
I look
blast.
forward to it, man.
Thanks again, man.
All right, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Thanks for tuning in to the Undraped Artist Podcast. If you enjoyed it, subscribe. And if you could, leave a comment or review. That really helps the channel. Please share the show with your friends, and if you're feeling generous, consider a monthly donation at theundrapedartist.com. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next week.